afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. In part one of our three-part series, we'll be dissecting the findings of our latest threat report. In this report, we wanted to know just how aware UK enterprises are of bots and if they fully understand the threat to their business. So we spoke to 200 enterprise businesses across travel, entertainment, e-commerce, and financial services to get that broad picture of how bots are understood and protected against. Andy Still, Netacea's CTO and co-founder, will be leading today's discussion. Andy is a pioneer of digital performance for online systems. As Chief Technology Officer, he leads the technical direction for Netacea's products, as well as providing consultancy and thought leadership to clients. Andy has also authored several books on computing and web performance, application development, and non-human web traffic. Before we launch into our dissection of the threat report, Andy is going to give us an overview of what bots are and how they're affecting businesses on a global scale. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Danny. So, as Danny said, we've been doing quite a lot of research into bots, which we'll take you through later, and we'll talk you through some of the threats associated with bots and some of the ways that you can handle that within your systems that you're protecting. But before we started, I thought it would be a good start just to give a quick overview of what bots are, in case there's anyone on the call who's not particularly familiar with what we're talking about. So a bot, basically, at the simplest term, is any request that's made to a web-based system, so website, API, mobile app, that's made by an automated process rather than something that's triggered directly by a human. And that turns out makes up quite a lot of the activity that we see on our web systems. There's quite a lot of good bots out there, and it's safe to say that without these bots, the internet would not operate in the way that we are familiar with today. Most obvious ones being search engines, so Google, Bing, etc., send out spiders to index websites and populate the search engines. But as well as that, we've got things like security scanners and uptime checkers, which do a good job of making sure that everything is still operating correctly. But on the negative side, there's quite a lot of different types of bad bot activity. So anything from things like account takeover, so credential stuffing attacks, to content scraping, and a whole load of other activities. I would say there's just a lot of automation out there that is going on sites on pretty much every site. I just wanted to, before we get into some of the details, just highlight why we segment what we call bot activity, why we segment that from what we think of as traditional hacking activity. And the main difference there is that what hackers were trying to do traditionally was send out particular requests or interactions with web-based systems that were targeting on trying to get illegitimate activity within that system. So a SQL injection attack, for example, was sending a series of commands to a web server that enabled the attacker to gain access to the database in a way that the application designer had never intended. Whereas what bot activity does is actually send legitimate activity to web systems, and the objective there is to exploit certain business logic weaknesses. So the requests made are the same as humans would, they're just made in different orders or different combinations of requests that enable people to exploit certain weaknesses. I'll hand back over to Danny now to start going through some of the results of the survey that we did.
Great, thanks, Andy. So yeah, we'll start having a look at what we found from our respondents. So in 2020, we know that the poor security of other businesses is now very much your problem. And what our experience at Netacea reveals is that while you might have excellent best-of-breed security measures in place yourself, lax security measures elsewhere are still putting your business and your customers at risk. So this is despite efforts to educate users about cybersecurity best practices. And while many still use those same weak passwords across multiple accounts, over recent years, we've seen several occasions where this has not only affected business financially, but damaged their reputation severely. So bots can evade tests that are designed to keep them out, and they'll also mimic human behavior, and they'll learn to avoid security measures such as rate limiting and the basic Java protection methods. This makes accounts of all sizes easier to access and sell them for a profit. So Andy, you often refer to the challenge as the exploitation of business logic functionality. Would you be able to explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, Danny, I can. So I think the easiest way for this is probably if I start by going through just a quick example, of a real-world example of a business logic attack that we saw. So the attack that we saw was basically involved. The end result was that people were logging into this particular system, and they were seeing orders that had been created within their account. And when they looked into that in more detail, they saw that actually that order had been created within their account, had been paid for by someone getting a refund for one of their previous orders. That refund was paid back in credit, and that credit was then used to place an order. So the upshot of this was that the customers logged in and they saw unusual or unknown activity on their website, and the company in question, had obviously had to refund, or was paying for that order out of a refund for a product that had not actually been refunded. So the company was out of pocket. That obviously created quite a lot of bad press, and it created quite a lot of mistrust of the system going forward, as well as obviously the financial problems associated with that. But from our point of view, what was interesting in that is that was an attack that took place that involved no illegitimate activity within the system itself. It's just down to the combination of actions that was undertaken. So if you think about the business logic involved here, it's perfectly legitimate that a user should have an account, and within that account they should see all their previous orders. It's perfectly legitimate that they have the facility to request a refund for an order, and that refund be processed through the system. And it's perfectly legitimate that that refund be processed as credit rather than giving the user the money back. You think that would be a preferable solution to most companies. And then it's obviously legitimate that credit be spent on another order. So the legitimate going on there, it's just who had undertaken those and how they've gone about that. But what I think is even more interesting to get into as we start to talk more about bot activity is to look at the layer below that and identify exactly what had happened here, because whilst it looks like a fairly straightforward thing, there was actually quite a number of parties involved and quite a number of processes. So rather than this just being kind of one individual who was cracking an account and then undertaking that refund and then the order, what probably happened here is that this would start off with an external data breach somewhere. So on another system somewhere, someone would have got hold of a whole load of sets of credentials, and they probably would have then made those available either for sale or via other means to probably on the dark web for use elsewhere. Those credentials would then be got hold of by someone who would undertake a credential stuffing attack against this particular website. And what they do there is take potentially thousands or hundreds of thousands of credentials and just attempt to log in. The objective being to see whether or not they can then successfully access this particular website. At the end of that, they will end up then with a smaller set of credentials which they know are valid for that website. At that point, they may then sell those on to someone else as a set of valid credentials for this particular website. This second actor would then take those known valid credentials and start a more targeted functionality attack on that website. And what that will do is look, take the credentials and look which ones they can log in, which ones will log in and have a particular order that meets the format for what they want to do, and then potentially also automate the carrying out of the refund of that order. So at the end of that process, you're left then with a set of accounts that have an amount of credit available because they've successfully completed the refund. At that point, they can then sell that credit on to someone else who can actually make use of that. And this last step may well be that it's a human actor comes in who's bought, say, £100 worth of credit on this particular website and goes on and actually spends that credit to get the goods themselves and then gets there delivered. I think the key part from this is that there's a lot of different actors involved in this and a lot of tools, processes that come together to ultimately get to the point where the person carries out that fraud. And I think we'll go into this in a bit more detail as we go through today. We'll see some more examples of what we call the bot ecosystem, which is just how the world out there is starting to enable all these processes to interact together. And obviously we need to start putting up defenses against those. I'll pass back over to Danny now to pick up some more of the outputs from our survey.
Great, thank you for that explanation, painting that really clear picture of the current bot landscape for us, Andy. So our survey of the state of bot attack starts with some really good news. Businesses are aware of the bot problem, but they might not yet fully understand it. And so what exactly does that mean? What do they know? So they have revealed that they do have some bot mitigation in place, and just 1% of respondents said that they did not have a bot mitigation solution in place. And that was only because they were holding back on investment, not because they didn't intend to implement it. Andy, you've been working in bot management for a number of years now. How have you seen approaches to bot management shift? Do you think we're going to see these numbers split in the next few years from having a mostly full bot management shift, or do you think we're going to see a more gradual change?
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, I think what we will see is we will see the number on the right, people have full bot management solution increasing. And I think what we will also start to see is the evolution of the types of bot management. I think the distinction here between full and partial is very interesting, because it would be good to understand what people are categorizing as partial bot management versus full bot management. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of different types of bot protection out there. Not all of it is equal, and we've seen quite a lot of evolution over the years. And I'll just quickly go through some of the different types, and then what we expect to see over the year as time goes forward is that more people are getting to the newest type of bot management, which I think is the type that offers a reasonable level of protection. So the first generation of bot management products really just looked at network traffic. They were typically kind of extensions to WAFs, load balancers, CDNs, and I think these are the type of tools that people may be referring to when they say they've got a partial solution in place. What they would do, they would look at the traffic and give fairly basic defenses. So they'd have block lists of known offenders. They'd add a degree of rate limiting in, so look at the speed of requests that are being made. And this would cut out some of the very basic bots that were available, particularly at that time. And what we see as the evolution of bot management goes on, it's a circular thing. Defenses come in place, and then attackers learn those defenses and manage to get past them. And most bots can now bypass these types of solutions. And just pulled out this one example of rate limiting was a common solution in the past. And what we see in this example, the bot here, all the circles of requests we're seeing from bots, and they just keep ramping up the amount of requests they're making, and they do that until they hit some sort of rate limit, and then they know the level at which they can go under, and they then look at distributing the attack more widely so that rate limited, they can bypass rate limiting. And that's the sort of sophistication of bots, and that leads on to new defenses being put in place. And the next generation of defenses was a client-side system. What that basically means is that when your web browser or your mobile app makes a request to a server, the server returns the content, but it also returns a set of activities that they want the browser or the app to undertake. When they've undertaken those, they send the results of undertaking those activities back to the bot detection tool. The bot detection tool validates whether or not those activities have been undertaken by a human or by an automated process, and then takes appropriate action. Types of activities that were usually undertaken, some sort of a proof of work. So if you start from the assumption that the system that the bot is being executed from will not have the same level of functionality as that being used by a human. So, for example, they will not be able to execute JavaScript in the same way as a legitimate web browser would. The second type of thing was look at device fingerprinting. So what can we find out about the device that the request is coming in from? So, you know, does it look like a laptop computer, or does it look like a server? Does it look like an actual mobile device? What unique identifiers can we determine from that? And then can we start identifying individual devices to see whether or not multiple users are coming in from the same device? And then the last type of client-side traps we looked at were looking at how the user actually interacts with that device. So how do they use the mouse? How do they type? How do they hold the mobile device? You know, and all those kind of things to determine whether or not that looks like a legitimate human user that's interacting with that system, with that particular device. Then that's all sent back to obviously the bot management system. The issue you've got here is that you send that request down to the client and ask them to undertake some activities and send some data back. You've told the attacker what defense you're putting in place. So the obvious issue here is if that's coming back to the web browser, if that was a bot, it can replicate those activities. It can either do that by reverse engineering them, so determine what they're looking for, or by looking at executing the script from a real browser or a real mobile device. And you see shots of rooms full of actual mobile devices, you know, all running automated traffic and all acting like they're being held by legitimate users. Same with browsers. You can automate the scripting of browsers these days. So these sort of things become easier to bypass. What you then end up with is just an arms race. So you have to you put a new trap in, the bots learn how to bypass it, you have to put a new one. So you're continually trying to stay ahead, which led to, when we talk about the bot ecosystem, there is a part of the bot ecosystem which is things that are just focused on bypassing bot defenses. And I've just pulled a couple of examples here. These are things off GitHub of scripts that people have created to make sure you get past any bot defense. And these things are continually changing. And I think flags at the bottom here, one of the things they've put in here is the fact that they've added some JavaScript execution functionality in here, so they can just execute some of the JavaScript being sent over rather than having to kind of bypass it. But when we're looking at client side as well, one of the problems is everything you do on the client is adding risk to what you do. That's security risk, privacy risk, and as well as just a regression risk. So you're continually having to push out new versions of code which have to be tested. They could create issues, and you're putting complex JavaScript on the client, which again could be a security issue. And then things like the device fingerprinting that you're having to do to stay ahead of the bots. You are looking at pushing right to the edge of what the browser operators want you to do. And we're starting to see already some of the major browsers actually clamping down on this, and the app platforms as well, and you know, not letting apps do all the things that they previously want to. So that is again one of the issues with this client side approach. The last problem you have with client side is that as websites and apps get better protection, more and more activities happening on APIs anyway. APIs don't have a client, so the client side element is very difficult to do. So attacks just move on to APIs. APIs become the new weak point. So we need something that also defends APIs. Which leads us on to the newest approach to dealing with bots, which is actually going back to the server, but looking at what visitors are doing, how they're interacting with the server, what functionality within your website are they actually calling. We can look then, what are visitors doing? Are they matching kind of known attack patterns that they've done before? Can we then categorize them? But what we can also do there is look at what all the visitors are doing. Bots don't usually operate on their own. So they're usually part of a group of bot activity, particularly now distributing bot attacks is so easy with the various approaches that you've got there with cloud services and distributed proxies and things like that. So we're usually seeing distributed attacks, quite widely distributed attacks. But if you start looking at behavior, you can usually start grouping together people of similar behavior. So you can see all the bots, no matter where they're coming from, they're all doing the same thing. So you can group that behavior together. And that may be that it's a behavior that we know, it's a particular type of attack. Or it may also be that it's just a new, unusual type of behavior. So bot attacks evolve all the time. So you need to not only be looking for what you've seen before, you also need to be looking for what are the new attack vectors and attack patterns that they're trying to undertake. And this kind of server-side behavior view allows you to get that view of bot behavior. The issue with this problem is that it's an extremely large amount of data, and it's a large amount of complexity to actually do that detection. It's a machine learning activity that you need to do, and you need to be constantly tuning those algorithms to stay on top of new behavior. It's particularly challenging if you're trying to do it in real time, as you need to do to actually be stopping bot activity. But the good news is if you can get that, if you can get over some of those hurdles, then the results that you can see with that, and this is the approach that Netacea takes as a company to bot activity. So just some of the results we are getting from this approach, we can see here, just as an example on the bottom left, against someone using some of the older bot management techniques, particularly the client-side ones, we're spotting around 38% more bot activity than seen through there. We're against the one on the bottom right, which is against what you'd think of as a typical generation 1, so one of the security appliances. We're seeing again 75% more threats than they were detecting using the traditional one, and we would expect those numbers to grow up as the sophistication of bots increases and they're managing to bypass those systems more. Okay, Danny, I think I'll pass back over to you to talk through a few more of these statistics.
Yeah, just quickly before we do, Andy, I just wanted to ask about the numbers that you went through in the previous slide. They are absolutely enormous numbers. So I was wondering, are they typical for bot activity? And is that the kind of scale of attack that most enterprise organizations would expect to see?
Yeah, I think obviously it varies from organization to organization, geography to geography and vertical to vertical, but I would say these are fairly typical. And I think they're fairly typical of the levels that we are detecting each time. And I think what has also been revealing when we've done these kind of bits of analysis is that I think most companies we deal with aren't realizing that the amount of traffic or bot traffic that they think they're seeing is anywhere near as much as it actually is when we actually get into it. So the example on the top right here, which was against an in-house team who put a lot of time and effort into building systems to identify bot traffic, they'd identified the areas in orange here, and what they saw was a pattern of behavior where they thought it was a small number of fairly large spikes of activity. When we've gone in and actually done some work with them, we found not only were the spikes bigger than they thought, but actually there's a low level of continuous low and slow attacks that are going on there. And I think a lot of customers we work with have not seen that view. They're thinking it's more of spikes of bot activity and nothing in between. But as we've done more work, we see fairly constant streams of low and slow, low level activity going on. So yeah, I would say these numbers are fairly typical.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to see how much that blue section is, like how significant it is. So that, yeah, thank you for clarifying that a bit further. Okay, so that leads us perfectly onto the bot attacks businesses have identified as their greatest challenges, and why the nature of these attacks makes them such a great threat. So it's really good to see that businesses are identifying these attacks as their top threats, because it directly correlates with the most common attacks faced by our customers. So last year, for instance, we helped a global retailer that was experiencing well over 500,000 malicious login attempts a week. And that was as attackers were trying to gain brute force entry to customer accounts. And what the attackers were doing was buying breached usernames and passwords to access customer accounts and make fraudulent purchases to the tune of millions of pounds a month. They then sell validated details on the dark web. It's a really big business, and as I just said, it means that the attacker profits twice with fraudulent activity plus then selling the details on the dark web. And these types of brute force attacks, the credential stuffing attacks, are increasingly common, which is why we can see a huge 82% of our respondents identifying these attacks as a top threat to their business. So my question to you, Andy, is how would attackers typically carry out such an attack?
Well, I think one of the things that has changed over the last couple of years is really how easy it is to get into this. And I think in some, talk to some customers, they have a perception that there's a large level of technical ability needed, and these are specially targeted attacks, but it's really not. And I think this comes down to, as we've said before, the growth of what we call the bot ecosystem. And what that is there's a growing marketplace and world out there full of different tools, services, and different techniques as well that can be easily undertaken. And I think the services part of this is something that I found particularly interesting, is that these are almost legitimate commercial services, that can be used to actually help with the distribution and automation and really ramping up of these attacks to the industrial kind of levels that we are seeing. These are not attacks that are being undertaken by couple of people with a small number of machines. These are taken across thousands of different machines. But I'll talk you through just some of the ways that you can actually get up and running if you wanted to do a credential stuffing attack. First thing is you need a credential stuffing tool, and all this does is automates the processing of requests from a large set of usernames and passwords, or combo list as they're known, and actually just automates trying those against a particular website. These tools you can download. You don't even, you're not even having to go on the dark web for these. You can just go to Google, search for Storm, and Storm is just one of a number of them. It's just there. You can download it. I think the thing about this for me is that these are good quality pieces of software. They've got a nice user interface. They come with support. So they're supported pieces of software. Right. So the next thing you need to do is you need to get hold of some credentials. Let's try that, or combo list as we call them. Just an example here in this video, going again on the perfectly clear web to Twitter to check my dump and click through a link, and you can download from there lists of credentials. You can then start using those in a credential stuffing attack. These, there's many of these available, some of them quite small, some of them absolutely thousands. So these are just there, as I say, available here on the clear web. You can use those to launch any kind of attack. Again, just another example here of just search for combo lists. Again, here on Google, plenty of answers. So these are available, and these are not on, as I say, they're not on the dark web. The general life of a combo list is that starts with the people who actually hack. They get some value out of it. They sell it on then to a smaller group of people who get more value out of it, and then gradually is worth less as it's sold in the more and more open area. And these kind of things on which will end up on the public web are probably towards the end of that process. The next stage is then you've got your tool, you've got your combo list. You then need what's called the config, and what that is it's a bit of scripting that tells the tool, so storming this request, what the process is it needs to follow to actually attempt to log into a particular website. There's a whole load of examples here, and these are with every one of the tool sets. There's then a community of people who create configs, and then obviously people can contribute to that. And I think pretty much all of our customers, when we've looked in these areas, there have been configs available for their website. So if you're listening to this, there's a fair chance that there's a config there for your website. And again, as I said, the way the ecosystem is going is that some of these are, contributed and shared for free, but there's actually a marketplace now where people write configs and they sell them on. And again, these come with warranties and kind of a good customer experience around it. So if you buy one of these and the website they're attacking has changed, then the people building the config will fix that for you, come with a degree of guarantee. And there's again thousands of these available, and people are making money, so they're commercializing different parts of the ecosystem. And then the last stage is that when you launch this attack, you need to distribute that. And again, there's go on the internet, you can find anonymous proxy networks, you can find compromised machines and botnets to do this. But then there's this increasingly sort of legitimate layer to do this of residential proxy systems. And again, you can go online, pay for these services, and they will guarantee a distribution of that attack across a number of different IP addresses that you pay for, and they will distribute those across different geographies, and they will guarantee that they have come from residential connections. And how these systems work is that they will get legitimate users to sign up for services, a typical one being a free VPN service, another one being you use a free game on your phone, and part of that terms and conditions is that it allows the game maker or the VPN operator to use your device to actually send connections through. And those essentially real users signing up for these services, probably not realizing that this is part of what they're getting with the free VPN, but their machines are then being used as part of a credential stuffing attack. So the credential stuffing attack is then distributed, and it's coming in from legitimate connections, which makes it very hard to detect at a network level. And there's a potential also that the user on their residential home machine can then be flagged up as an attacker. So that's just a very quick high-level overview of how credential stuffing attack may be undertaken. I think what I hope to get across then is that it's fairly easy to do. Obviously, you could get up and running, you could be doing these fairly easy. Most of the work has already been done for you. It's a matter of putting together, paying for the tools, or getting hold of the tools, getting hold of the config and the config lists.
Great, thank you, Andy. I think what was really interesting there was, as you said, the accessibility of the tools. So I know that my head is boggled by the fact that, one, so many of these are available on the clear web, and that they are this completely professionally run service that has very little restriction around it. So if anybody has any questions about this marketplace, or wants to ask about any of the tools and what they can be doing to protect their businesses against actors who will be using such tools, which, as we've just seen, are readily accessible and extremely easy to use with a simple search term, then please fire them across in the chat and we will get all of your questions answered at the end of the webinar. Or alternatively, contact us on Twitter as well if that's easier for you, and we will make sure that your question is answered on there as well. Okay, so looking at these results here, we again might think that this is really reassuring. We can see that 76% of businesses have acknowledged that they've been attacked in the last 2 years, but 2 years is a really long time. And to me, that doesn't really seem like a high enough figure. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's reassuring that 74% of people have detected the attacks. I suspect that based on our experience, the 24% who have not been attacked in the last 2 years have probably just not detected that attack. And I think if they took on board some of the kind of recommendations that we've talked about today, then they may well find that there's been an attack that they detected. Certainly, I don't think we've come across any customers who are not seeing any bot activity.
Yeah, and that is supported by the charts that we saw earlier with all of the activity that the server-side approach was able to detect and mitigate that the previous security solution was unable to, and so it just kind of makes that hit home a little bit harder. But it's all about the visibility. Okay, so we've got one last slide, and then we will be on to the question and answer section of today's webinar. So if you do have any questions, as I said, please do fire them across in the next few minutes, and we'll make sure that Andy can answer them while we're during this webinar. Okay, so every business that we spoke to said that they are constantly evaluating their bot management strategy. Again, very good result on the surface. And over 2/3 have evaluated their strategy in the last 6 months. This shows businesses are taking the bot threat seriously. And this is also backed up by the amount of money that businesses are putting into defeating bots. So around 10% of cybersecurity budgets, according to our survey, are allocated to bot mitigation, and nearly 100% of those we asked were looking to increase this budget in the future. But is this enough? So attackers are changing their techniques all the time to get around the defences that are put in place, and it's a continual game of cat and mouse. So right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Andy, you talked a lot about the need to be a greater consideration for bot management as an essential investment. So bearing this research in mind, and bearing in mind that we actually end up getting our results around the onset of the pandemic, so there's a bit of crossover there. Do you want to go into a little bit about why you think that there needs to be this greater consideration for bot management as an essential cybersecurity investment?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I think these results, as you say, are fairly reassuring that pretty much everyone has looked at their bot strategy within the last year, and I think that's really important. What we are seeing is that the bot threat is growing all the time, so you need to be treating bot management as an essential part of your website security strategy, and that has only become more important as the world has moved more online due to the pandemic that's been going on. More and more things are dependent on online services, and therefore they're becoming a bigger and bigger target. And as we're seeing that generally, most websites are actually pretty secure. They've got good security policies in place. We need to make sure that the bot management element is up to the same level and is treated with the same seriousness as those other areas of website security.
Absolutely. And so that does lead us nicely into our first question of the afternoon. So we've been asked, what is the biggest threat that you see from bot activity at the moment?
That's a great question. And I think I would say in terms of the type of bot, I think the biggest one is still probably the activity we see around credential stuffing. I think there's so many compromised credentials out there now that we are seeing an extremely large amount of credentials. I think anywhere that has a username and password and login process will be at threat from that. I think that's the biggest threat from the type of bot. But I think overall the biggest threat, I think, is the kind of thing that we were talking about earlier with the bot ecosystem, which is just making these attacks so much easier for people to undertake, which therefore is just increasing the amount of them. It's increasing the prevalence, and therefore it's starting to affect almost every website. What number of years ago was only the kind of largest websites being threatened by this. This is becoming ever more ubiquitous, and I think that growth of the ecosystem to me is the biggest worry for the growth of bot threats.
Yeah, I think that again filters through into everything we've seen today. So in terms of what our survey respondents was identifying themselves as some of the greatest threats to their business, and what we'll actually talk a little bit about next week in terms of what they identify as the greatest risks associated, and what the impact of bot attacks are. So that helps me answer a question that's come in for us on how do I join the remaining 2 sessions. So after today's webinar, we will be sending out a link to next week's recording. So as you are all already registered, you don't need to do anything else. You will get a nice and easy link to follow for the next 2. And you will also get access to this webinar on demand. So another question here. Do you sell real-time threat intelligence data to telcos to do DNS-based blocking? That's one for you, Andy.
It's got the simple answer to that is yes. We have a service that can do that. It's something that we provide as part of our service to all our customers, which we call it our dynamic threat database, which is something that's building up in real time all the sort of threat that we see across our network. And as we say, we do sell that on as a service to other larger organisations as well.
Great. I hope that helps in terms of the answer. The question you're asking. But if you would like to follow that up, then please do get in touch with us for any further details on that at hello@netacea.com. So that applies to any questions that have come through after this afternoon's webinar. So on to our final question. What effect do things like password rotation, hygiene, and multi-factor authentication have on this? So with this applying to bot management, I'm assuming that's if anybody would like to clarify on that one, please do.
Yeah, so password hygiene is a really good one, and I think if we could solve that problem, then the credential stuffing threat would go down dramatically. But that doesn't seem to be a problem that is solvable, and I think that the issue associated with that, and it comes into multi-factor authentication. Again, multi-factor authentication, if everyone used multi-factor authentication, this threat would be dramatically reduced as well. The battle that we find, and across all these business logic kind of exploits, is that it's a constant battle between user friction versus security, which is an age-old balancing act. We find most of our customers don't want to put that kind of friction on the user experience. And when it comes to password hygiene is difficult to enforce. We do see some companies, will interact with some of the credential breaches software in the background and actually warn their customers when they see breaches of that username, and I think that's a really good service. And I think the more that companies can do around that to add security to the user, and try and get better password hygiene, get better log-on experience, I think the better. And I think the really good approaches that we see customers undertaking is to take some of the warnings that we can give them around what is potentially a credential stuffing attack, and modify the user experience to then add more challenges to that. So, for example, they would let users log in with a normal username and password, but if something that we have flagged as a higher risk, they may then demand MFA passwords, or they may then put some challenge questions in there. So you're keeping that user experience as close to possible, as close to the preferred frictionless user experience for most users. But when they're flagged as higher risk users, they put that little bit more friction, and they can tune that friction based on the level of risk that they associate with them. And I think that's where we've seen the more sophisticated companies we work with trying to progress, so that they're getting that right balance of security versus user experience.
Absolutely. So it's not about just putting a hard block solution in place, but putting the right challenges in place according to the behaviour. Okay, thank you for everybody's questions this afternoon. And as I said, everybody who has attended or registered for today's webinar will be receiving a follow-up email with access to next week's, as well as the on-demand video for today's webinar. So I hope you found it useful and got some really insightful takeaways from Andy today. If you do have any questions that occur to you in the next few days, then please do feel free to pop them over either via Twitter or via hello@netacea.com. Similarly, if this has got the cogs whirring about your own bot management strategy, then do feel free to get in touch at hello@netacea.com. But for now, we'll see you at the same time in the same place next week for part 2. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you Andy for leading a really insightful dissection of not only some of our threat report, but also giving us that really interesting insight into the bot management landscape.
Thank you, Danny.